Slavery and the African American Story, Part 10. White people created laws to keep enslaved people from learning to read and write, which is why reading is political. One of the many reasons why reading is actually political, despite what some book influencers want to tell you. During slavery, white people enacted many laws to keep Black people, both enslaved and free, from learning to read and write. White slaveholders recognized the power of literacy to transform people's lives and inspire them to dream and think for themselves. They certainly didn't want that for the people they held as slaves. They assumed that by keeping Black people illiterate, they could maintain power over them. They assumed wrong. Even though the majority of enslaved people could not read or write, they could reason for themselves. Just as the founding fathers believed British rule over their lives and affairs in America was oppressive, enslaved people knew that their lifelong bondage and subjugation were wrong. This was especially true for those who remembered their lives in Africa before captivity. But even those who were born into slavery and had never lived any other way understood the power of living as free people. Learning to read and write English wasn't the easiest thing for captive Africans to do. The Africans who were brought to the United States came largely from oral traditions, which in history and folklore are learned and passed down by memory, recitation, rather than written in books. So seeing white people reading and writing was strange for sure. But even without understanding what reading was, many enslaved Africans felt there was a power in books. In the classic slave narratives, the collection by Henry Louis Gates Jr., formerly enslaved people such as Oluda Equino, Frederick Douglass, and Harriet Jacobs described the great lengths to which white people went to keep the enslaved populace illiterate, and the parallel insatiable desire of those oppressed to learn to read and write. In the interesting narrative of life of Odula Equino, or Gustavus Vasa the African, he explains and describes the fascination he experiences when he sees his master and his old friend Dick reading. He says, I often see my master and Dick employed in reading, and I had a great curiosity to talk to the books, as I thought they did, and so to learn how all things had a beginning. For that purpose, I have often taken up a book, and I have talked to it, and then put it to my ears, when alone, in hopes it would answer me. And I have been very much concerned when I found it remaining silent. Despite his initial misconception about books, he was a quick study, which helped him in a number of ways. As luck would have it, in 1765, his last owner, Robert King, promised to let him buy his freedom for the sum of 40 pounds, which is over 10,000 US dollars today. Aquino worked very hard to earn the money. King, like some other slave owners, allowed him to earn money of his own when he was done working for his master. It was during his free time that he became skilled at selling goods. Pretty soon he had earned 47 pounds, which he offered to King to cover his original ask price plus interest. Once he had purchased his freedom, he went on to learn how to read and write. His autobiography, published in 1789, was widely read and highly influential. Frederick Douglass, one of the most influential Black abolitionists, was born and raised on plantations in Maryland. Douglass's yearning for freedom was fueled by separation from his family, by the unimaginable physical violence he endured at the hands of his master and plantation overseer, and by his awareness of the injustices other enslaved people suffered, an awareness that gained as a result of learning to read. Douglas witnessed the measures white people took to keep enslaved people from learning to read and write, and their violent wrath at the mere suspicion that an enslaved person was interested in learning. As a youngster living on Hugh and Sophia Ald's plantation, he had the very good fortune of having a kind mistress who took an interest in teaching him to read and write. But when Hugh discovered their lessons, he demanded that Sophia stop teaching the boy. Hugh believed that an education would lead to rebelliousness, a common belief among white people at the time. Of course, young Douglas was disappointed that his lessons had come to an end, and he was also deeply saddened that once his gentle and compassionate mistress had suddenly turned cold, suspicious, and violent at the mere sight of the boy holding a book or newspaper. But his dream of literacy wouldn't die. He had learned the alphabet, and soon he had a new plan for learning to read and write. In his 1845 biography, he explained, "The plan which I adopted, and the only one which I was most successful, was that of making friends of all the little white boys whom I had met in the street. As many of these as I could, I converted into teachers. With their kindly aid, obtained at different times in different places, I finally succeeded in learning to read. When I was sent of errands, I always took my book with me, and going one part of my errand quickly, I found time to get a lesson before my return. I also used to carry bread with me, enough of which was always in the house, and to which I was always welcome, for I was much better off in this regard than many of the poor white children in our neighborhood. This bread I used to bestow upon the hungry little urchins, who, in return, would give me that more valuable bread of knowledge. I am strongly tempted to give the names of the two or three of these little boys as a testimonial of the gratitude and affection I bear for them, but prudence forbids. Not that it would injure me, but it might embarrass them, for it is almost an unpardonable offense to teach slaves to read in this Christian country. It is enough to say of the dear little fellows that lived on Philpott Street, very near Durgan and Bailey's shipyard. I used to talk this matter of slavery over with them. I would sometimes say to them, I wish I could be as free as they would be when they got to be men. You'll be free as soon as you are 21, but I am a slave for life. Have have not I as good a right to be free as you have? These words used to trouble them. They would express for me the liveliest sympathy and console me with the hope that something would occur by which I might be free. His stick-to-itiveness would pay off. Once armed with the ability to read and write and speak passionately about the horrors of slavery, he became one of the most persuasive orators of the 19th century. He used his firsthand experience coming of age as an enslaved person to denounce the institution of slavery. His popularity and power of persuasion were white slaveholders' greatest fears realized. To keep enslaved people illiterate, white lawmakers developed harsh punishments for any enslaved person caught reading or learning to read. These included violent acts such as cutting off the fingers and limbs. It was even a crime for white people or black people who were illiterate to teach free or enslaved black people to read and write. Those who found ways to learn to read and write had to go through great pains to keep their skills a secret. Keeping enslaved people from reading was just another way to indoctrinate them with the idea that white supremacy ruled and black lives didn't matter other than to serve the plantation class, white elites, and even the lowliest of white people. As enslaved Africans and African Americans began to outnumber whites in certain communities, the threat of the threat of a Black majority that could read, write, and reason was a possibility that had to be fought at every turn. But even with legal barriers white people put in place to prevent enslaved and free Black people from learning to read and write, many, like Frederick Douglass, prevailed in their secret mission to become literate. Once literate, enslaved and free Black people used the written word to demonstrate their, and by extension, all Black people's intellectual capabilities by becoming prolific and eloquent writers. For example, a young woman named Phyllis Wheatley became one of the most beloved and highly acclaimed poets of the 18th century. When she was a little girl, of age 7 or 8, Whitley was stolen from her home and transported to Boston's docks, where she was purchased in 1761 by John Whitley and his wife Susanna, who wanted a domestic servant to support their household. Of course, little Phyllis didn't speak any English, but she was a quick learner. And there was more to the little girl. Sensing something remarkable in their house servant, the Whitleys decided to teach her to read and write when she wasn't busy with her chores. With her newfound skills, their prized pupil began devouring books on the subjects of history, geography, and astronomy, along with the Bible, which made a lasting impact on Phyllis's thinking and worldview. In time, it became evident that Phyllis was a gifted writer. John Whitley had a thriving business as a tailor and moneylender. Early in his career, he had served a police officer, and the Whitleys were a wealthy and influential family. Teaching enslaved people to read was illegal in Boston during those days, but John Whitley's circle of prominent friends shielded the couple from trouble with the law. At age 13, Phyllis became a published writer when her poem on Messrs. Hussey and Coffin about a narrowly avoided tragedy at sea ran in the Newport Mercury, a Rhode Island newspaper. This was followed 3 years later by another poem entitled An Eclectic Poem on the Death of that Celebrated Divine and Imminent Service of Jesus Christ, the Reverend and learned George Whitfield, printed by the Boston publisher Ezekiel Russell and John Boyle. Phyllis quickly became an internationally recognized poet, and the Whitleys supported her work and took her to meet dignitaries all around the world, though she wouldn't be free until the fall of 1773, not long before Susanna's death. It is believed that Phyllis wrote as many as 145 poems throughout her life. She did not devote a great deal of her writings to the subject of slavery, but when she did, she appealed to white Christians to recognize the humanity of enslaved people as a cause for abolition. But how presumptuous shall we hope to find divine acceptance with the Almighty, while yet they disgrace and hold in bondage Africa's blameless race. Let virtue win, and those accord our prayers. Be victory our, and generous freedom theirs. Sadly, after her benefactors passed away, Phyllis struggled to make a living during the tumultuous years of the Revolutionary War. She died in 1784 at just 31 years old. Nevertheless, Phyllis Whitley's talent, global reach, and critical acclaim are evidence of the great achievements thousands of enslaved people might have had they been allowed to read and write. Thank you for joining me for these 14 minutes of Black history and slavery in the African American story. I will see you next time for part 11, where we will talk about how Christianity was used to validate slavery but enslaved people didn't buy it. See you next time.